When words become weapons, the rise of radicalization and extremism.
Hey, everybody, this is Dr. Michelle, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Tab Talks. And today I have a really exciting guest, Shelley Inglis, and she's the executive director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Dayton. And she's kind of the expert on this topic. I was talking to a mutual friend, and she said, I know somebody that's really doing some exciting and powerful work in the area of extremism. And I thought, well, okay, I think we've seen enough on our airwaves recently that this is probably a discussion worthy of having. So I want to welcome you to Tab Talk, Shelley. Thanks for coming on the show tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Michelle. I really appreciate your attention to this issue, which is really important that we talk about it in Southwest Ohio.
Okay, well, I'm going to kick this football and then you tell me where it leads. And terms matter. And, I've used that term extremism, but there are also some other terms, radicalism, terrorism. I mean, they're just words out there. Can you frame this discussion for us? So when we talk about words and how words are inciting people to violence and to do just some extremely outlandish and crazy things, kind of walk us through what those terms are so that the audience understands.
Yeah, sure. And they are abstract and they have, different meanings to different people sometimes. So radicalization is really a process. And what we mean by that is it's a process that people go through, an individual or in terms of a group, where people come to believe that using violence or the threat of violence is necessary or even justified to accomplish their goal. So that's basically it. Like they come to justify violence in the name of a specific goal. And it's a process. We're really concerned about that goal being a political or social goal. And we're really concerned about the violence that involves, right? That people come to think that violence is how you solve your problem or how you justify or how you get to your goal. And we're really concerned about that domestically. Terrorism, of course, for many people is associated with international terrorism, but what we're focusing on is domestic violent extremism. And that's really where individuals or groups who are primarily working in the United States from the United States, where they come to believe that and they come to use the use of force or violence as a way to reach their political or social goal.
And you know what I found interesting about this is these are everyday people. These are people that you would work alongside. These are people that you would see in the grocery store that now are demonstrating these extreme ideologies to the point that they're resorting to violence just to be heard. It's incredible. What has been the catalyst for radicalization? Now that you've defined that for us.
Yeah, so it's really a complex question. And you were talking about it at different levels, right? So there's the individual, and then there are groups, and then there's the social reality that people live in society. So it's a complex set of factors that lead to radicalization and extremism. Some of the best research talks about three pillars of radicalization, that the individual and the group have a need, like a psychological need or a level of frustration that they need to address. And then there's the narrative. So this is three N's: need, narrative, where there's an ideology or a story that justifies a worldview, that justifies their grievances, that justifies their needs and shapes the way they view the world. And then usually there's also the third end, which is a social network, where there's a group of people who are doing similar things, who support and who feed into that narrative, address that need, and also enable people, right? And often those networks are found online, but they're also in groups. And we can talk about the links, for example, to certain concrete things like taking steps to gain weapons or to use sort of military type equipment. But we think about it as needs and narrative and network. And then in terms of the individuals, and in terms of prevention, which is what we're really interested in, we're interested in preventing these kinds of ideologies to leading to violence and preventing that violence. You need to really think about what are the risk factors, like what are the factors that feed into people's need, narrative, and network, and what are the protective factors, like how do we strengthen in society ways to protect people or to help them not have those needs and the narrative and the network. So risk and protective factors are the way we think about individuals and in their social realities, and how do we lower the risks and raise the protective factors against radicalization.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent response. You talk about the need and the narrative. I want to focus on the narrative, because I'm sure there are people that will say, that's my freedom of speech, to be able to believe and espouse these beliefs the way that I feel comfortable doing that. How does this extremism narrative align with freedom of speech, or does it align at all?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an important one, and an important one that people think about and understand for a number of reasons. So in the United States, extremist views and ideologies are not prohibited per se, right? And that's part of the freedom of speech and freedom of thought. It's particularly, though, difficult when those views are hateful or clearly anti-Semitic, racist, discriminatory, or exclusionary. It's very difficult to address that. And I'll talk a little bit about how, as a human rights person, I think about that. But it is the acts of violence that we in the United States are prohibited. And our Constitution does have broad protections from freedom of speech, freedom of the media, freedom of association, and freedom to protest. These are really important protections for a human rights person like me. It's essential in a democratic society to have those protections. But there are also globally views about hate speech that vary. Even if you believe in freedom of speech and freedoms related to association and assembly, there are different views. And so European countries, for example, take different views on what kind of hate speech is allowed, where the guardrails are set around hate speech. So it is a complex issue. In the United States, there are broad protections. We have to be looking at preventing for that reason. Prevention becomes even more important. And of course, the violence itself is not protected.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about freedom of thought. As I was listening to you respond to that question, my thoughts then lead to action. And it's the action, I think, that's getting us in trouble, because we're not saying that people are not free in a society, in a democratic society, to be free thinkers. But it's when those thought processes take you to actions that lead to violence, that lead to blocking the rights of other people. I think that's where we become concerned that extremism, in terms of your views now, violates my rights to be a happy citizen, to be free to walk the streets, to be free to have views that are different from yours, and not feel like I have to die for them or I have to lose property because of those differences. It's just exceptional response. Okay, so can you give our audience some characteristics of what some of these groups look like? Because, if I had to personally assess, how people can or should not become aligned with these groups, what are things that they should see and maybe have some red flags about, I really thought this was a cool group. And now all of a sudden I'm feeling a little uncomfortable with some of the things that this group is saying, because now they want me to do something. I don't want just me to be on the internet talking. They now want me to do something. What characteristics should people look out for?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that can be on multiple levels. So we in a lot of our trainings, we also look at like symbols and platforms so people understand some of the imagery and the slogans that are used by groups. Those are important to know, and they're more and more in the mainstream. So we definitely think it's important that people understand to the extent they can. And to be honest, these groups are always, evolving in terms of where they're present and how they're coming out. On a broader level, exactly what you said, we're focused on extremist groups that you would talk about in terms of thinking about them as right-wing extremist groups. And the reason why we're focused on them is because these groups are really the area where violence takes place. So, studies have found that 96% of incidents where someone's been killed in an extremist way is by people committed to right-wing extremist ideologies. And these ideologies share characteristics. Those characteristics are sort of rejection of a concept, as you were saying, of like universal rights and social equity. There where sovereign nationalism, and here I'm not talking about patriotism. Patriotism is a very normal feeling that people have around their identity and their country, but where nationalism, a sense of nationalism over all things, and associating those with particular traits, particular races or particular religions, that is a characteristic. And then the closure to integration or multiculturalism, the rejection of others, the rejection of a pluralist society, those are characteristics. And so much of this now is fed by, conspiracy theories, or what we would call conspiracy narratives, as opposed to being coherent theories.
Yes.
These conspiracy narratives really are a trigger for a lot of this, start that process of people thinking in a certain way to start rejecting others and have very sort of narrow views. So I think those are some of the characteristics you're looking at. And, now it's very difficult and challenging because some of these narratives are very pervasive in our society. They're very commonplace, and they can be associated with certain forms of political views or parties. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that these groups are very savvy. So they will use terminology now, which it sort of upends the purpose of that terminology. So take like a concept like genocide, which is a concept of mass extermination of a people because of their race or ethnicity or religion. And so extremist groups use this concept of white genocide, for example, upending the whole, or you can take like the Proud Boys. They, for example, call themselves white chauvinists, but reject ideas that they are actually racist, anti-Black or anti-Muslim racist. So there's a lot of use of terminology to confuse people and to sort of upend people's understanding. And that's why it's complex and hard for people sometimes to follow, how do I really identify some of these views? They can be masked in sort of pro-male concepts or pro-masculinity, or like if you take the group of incels, who are an extremist group that focus in on hatred of women. And so some of these ideas of new masculinity can mask and is pervasive throughout a lot of these groups as well. So it's hard for and by new, I mean sort of what we would call in other ways toxic masculinity. It's hard for people to figure out, is this group really about a positive thing, or is some of those messaging masking a really hate-based and exclusionary and discriminatory ideology?
And see, you would think initially there's a stereotype that these are people that are uneducated and they don't understand, but these are not uneducated people. And I think that they're using strategies that are in fact very diabolical at their very nature, because they look to basically steer, I would say, unbeknowing people down a path that once they're down the middle, I'm like, because white chauvinist doesn't sound like Proud Boys. I mean, it really doesn't. And so, if you're a person that says, well, yeah, I'm chauvinistic, you wouldn't at all think that you would align with the Proud Boys until you start seeing that messaging is very much the same. You hit on something, Shelley, and it was very interesting, the use of social media and how social media has been it's been taunted as a wonderful thing. And I think it is. I can't imagine society without it. I came up at a time where we didn't have social media. Now we do. But there's a dark side of that social media, because it allows me to reach out and touch people that I would have never been able to touch before. How has that facilitated extremism?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it really is. It's one of the reasons why, this is a really pervasive issue. Extremist violence obviously has a history in the United States, but people ask us, why now and what is different now? And there are some key things. And one of them is our media landscape, our media ecosystem, and our social media ecosystem, and how that's used. And it's complex, as you mentioned. And the groups and ideologies are savvy, as you also said. They are often now out looking for publicity. You can more and more find their symbols, their slogans on cars, in communities, on websites, and on the internet. As I mentioned, they're also looking for acceptability. They constantly evolve their messaging to seem more acceptable to the mainstream, and they're looking to be accessible. They're looking for, to recruit and to be accessible to people. So social media is a great way to do that. And mis and disinformation, particularly disinformation, that is intended to, get people to drive a message with an aim that's inaccurate, it's untrue, but to drive people to think in a certain way, is a major challenge. And then misinformation, so people not intending harm, but spreading information that is false or inaccurate, is a big issue as well. And these all feed into extremist groups. You can find many of the mainstream platforms that we all talk about in social media have extremist elements on them. And then there are some more fringe places where these are messaging platforms that are encoded, or they're platforms where they're gaming, which is a huge issue, an area for recruitment to extremism. Their social media and sharing information platforms. So they vary. There are mainstream ones where extremists are present. You can find them, and they're there. There are niche ones where you really have to know where to go to get extremist content. And then there are obviously clandestine, or in the dark web, underneath what is publicly accessible, protected spaces where a lot of these groups interact and lead people to as well. But they're really everywhere. And so you have to be very aware. When we do a training, we often put Minecraft, which is a gaming platform that almost every young person, and particularly young boys, use. And Minecraft can be used for extremist messaging. People go on Minecraft and sort of recreate building for example, Auschwitz or other places where that represent sort of that extremist violence in Minecraft. And everybody, when we say that, everybody's like, oh my God, my kid's on Minecraft. And so it's really difficult. It's not everywhere on Minecraft. It's a specific way in which extremists interact with these platforms. And then, of course, the messaging apps, there's a lot, and on the individual level, there's a lot of evidence from cases that happen after the fact that perpetrators, of mass shootings, for example, in schools and other places, have used messaging apps to send out messages that they are going to commit some kind of violent act, often to peers or to family members. And at this point in our society, we have not gotten to the point where people are aware enough and empowered enough in prevention to act on the basis of those messages, of those threats before they actually take place. And that's part of the shift that we need, is for people to take very seriously the messaging in various ways in social media and other types of platforms.
I think you make a very interesting point when we talk about, it's almost like these entities hide in plain sight.
Yeah.
Because I remember early internet, when you would go into the chat rooms, and we all remember those chat rooms when they weren't as sophisticated or as well defined as they are now. And then you'd find yourself in a chat room, and it very quickly, some of those conversations would turn to, wait a minute, who am I in this chat room with? Because the internet wasn't that sophisticated then. And so you would get in these rooms and you'd be like, who am I really in here with? And I think kids don't understand, you really don't know who you're in these rooms with, who you're talking to. And then when these conversations that seem just really benign start turning very dark, you find yourself thinking, oh no, maybe I'm now listening and have been listening to this crazy talk for the last couple of months. And now all of a sudden I'm having opinions or feelings that I maybe didn't have before because I'm hearing all this information. And I found this really crazy stat, Shelley, where it talked about 62% of the information you get on the internet is just plain false. It's false. And people have come to, maybe, I think those in academia, we understand things are false, but I think we've become a citizenry of sound bites where, 3 minutes, TikTok gives you 3 minutes. And so you think, I know the whole story about something in 3 minutes. So there's not that fire that you want to go and find out more information, because you say, I'll just Google it. And you make an assumption that when you Google it, the answer you got was right. And so I think, unfortunately, the dumbing down of our society is leading to a lot of this radicalization, because I'm trusting and believing what complete strangers are saying to me. And that, to me, should be frightening for everybody, whether it's your children, whether it's you as a personal individual. You're being educated by a tool that can educate both positively and negatively. And I think people assume that all this information is for good and it's positive, and it's absolutely not. Who tracks these groups? I know you talked about, there's these extremist groups. Is there actually a body, I don't know, is that Homeland Security? Who's actually charged with finding these entities and tracking them?
Yeah, well, interesting question. And the work that we do, the Prevents Ohio project that we do, is funded by the Department of Homeland Security in their preventing terrorism and targeted violence grant. So definitely Homeland Security is working on this. We are a society where we have a lot of protections, and the idea is that not that the government is tracking people for their beliefs or their footprints online. So there are, there is a challenge around how do we as a society respond in a whole of society approach, and not assume that and not want actually law enforcement to be the primary mode of intervention. I think law enforcement is, of course, important, and a response to targeted violence and terrorism, what we're talking about, the violent acts, is essential. But I think the Department of Homeland Security has really taken a prevention approach. They have realized, and there is a complex history of our response to international terrorism post 9/11, as I'm sure you know, which had a lot of allegations and challenges around targeting specific people in the United States on the assumption because of their religion, or even a misunderstanding of what their religion is, that they might be associated with terrorism. So the Department of Homeland Security takes a prevention approach and a public health approach, which means it's not only a law enforcement this is a challenge for all of society. This is a challenge, in schools, for a lot of the risk factors have to do with suicide or crisis. People who have histories linked to domestic or other forms of violence. There are lots of issues around, links to social isolation, to grievance and bullying. So it's really needs a whole of society approach, and everybody should feel that they can contribute to preventing this problem, and not that this is only an issue for law enforcement, which is really where we don't want to be. We don't want to be in the world where law enforcement has to interdict, because that's when violence is taking place. We want to be, as a society, in a place where we are spreading good information, where we're providing people with the kind of mental health or other services they need to feel included, where we have mechanisms in place that basically help people not to go down this road of radicalization and build up protection against it.